In the halls of Alpha King Coin Holling's palace, the crying had become part of the architecture. 43 days. That was how long it had been since Queen Sarah died and left behind two sons who did not yet have words for what they had lost. Only the understanding that something essential was gone, and everything that came to replace it smelled wrong. The palace had exhausted its resources with quiet efficiency. Wet nurses, pack healers, senior Omegas whose very presence was supposed to carry pack calm in their blood. All of them had stood over those cradles and failed. The twins screamed. The king stopped sleeping. The court learned to move through the corridors on careful feet, speaking in low voices, avoiding the East Wing entirely. Emily Swarth had no business being near the East Wing. She was a palace maid, Wolfless, Omega by birth but below Omega in practice, the kind of servant the palace registered in the same category as its mops and its linen presses. She kept to her corridors. She kept to her hours. She had spent 4 years in this palace, becoming so reliably invisible that the senior staff had stopped scheduling her formally and simply trusted she would appear where she was needed and disappear when she was not. On the 43rd night, passing the nursery door on her corridor round, she heard something shift in the crying. Not louder, not quieter. A change in quality. A note beneath the screaming that registered in her chest before it reached her mind. The way a change in weather registers before the clouds arrive. She couldn't have explained it. She didn't try. She pushed open the nursery door. She crossed the room. She picked up the nearest twin. He stopped crying. In the east corridor, a nursemaid pressed her hand over her mouth. 3 floors above, in the study where he had been staring at the same dispatch for 40 minutes, Alpha King Coin Holling lifted his head. The palace went quiet. It had not been quiet in 43 days. The silence lasted exactly long enough for everyone who heard it to understand that something had happened that they did not have a category for. That was going to be the problem. Chapter 1. The maid who wasn't there, Emily, had been waking at 4 in the morning for so long that she no longer needed the bell. She was dressed and moving through the servants' passage before the eastern towers caught the first gray suggestion of dawn. Her corridor round mapped so precisely in her muscle memory that she could have walked it blind. 3rd passage left, then the long corridor past the tapestry hall, then the stone staircase with the loose step on the 7th riser that she had learned to avoid in her first week and that had apparently not been reported in the 4 years since. She avoided it still. She did not report things. She was not the kind of servant whose reports reached anyone with authority to act on them. This was fine. Emily had made her peace with the particular geography of her position a long time ago. Havenmore's palace was built the way its king was built. For function rather than welcome, all dark stone and high ceilings and corridors designed to make the people walking through them feel appropriately small. She had heard visitors describe it as impressive. She had heard the king's court describe it as magnificent. What she thought of it, alone at 4 in the morning with her mop and her linen count and the faint gray light coming through the high arrow-slit windows, was that it was very cold and that the flagstones in the east passage required regrouting along the north wall before winter made the water damage irreversible. She had noted this in the maintenance ledger twice. Nothing had happened. She had stopped noting it. The other servants were beginning to stir by the time she reached the kitchen corridor. The early kitchen staff, the bread bakers, the 2 junior footmen who were always slightly behind schedule and always slightly surprised to find her already finished with the ground floor passage. They moved past her without much acknowledgement. This was not unfriendliness exactly. Emily existed in the daily social mathematics of the palace staff, below the threshold where unfriendliness becomes relevant. You are not unfriendly to furniture. You simply do not address it directly. The one exception was Dorrit. Dorrit ran the palace laundry with the focused authority of a woman who had decided, 30 years ago, that clean linen was the only thing worth caring about and had not wavered since. She was waiting at the laundry corridor junction with a cup of something hot, which she held out to Emily without ceremony as Emily rounded the corner. "You're 3 minutes early," Dorrit said. This was her version of good morning. "The passage door," Emily said, taking the cup. "The east hinge is sticking. I came the long way." Dorrit made a sound that was not quite a response. She studied Emily for a moment with the particular attention of someone who is deciding whether to say a thing. Then she said it. "They're saying the night shift was bad. The twins." Emily drank from the cup. "They're always saying the night shift was bad. Worse than usual." Dorrit paused. The third nursemaid asked to be reassigned. Emily said nothing. Through the stone above them, very faint and very persistent, she could hear it, the sound that had been woven into the palace's daily rhythm for 43 days now, worn into the walls the way damp wears into old mortar. The crying. She had learned to hear it without reacting to it in the way the newer servants reacted, with flinching, with distress, with the reflexive human response to the sound of an infant in pain. She heard it the way she heard the east hinge sticking. As a fact about the building she moved through, present and unchanged. Or she had until last night. Last night something had been different. She had been at the far end of the east passage and the crying had shifted and her body had registered it as a change in weather, a change in pressure, and she had stood still for a moment with her mop and not understood why she had stopped moving. She had not gone to the nursery. Of course she had not gone to the nursery. The nursery was not her corridor. "Third one this month," Dorrit said. "They'll find another." They found 6 another's. Dorrit took back the empty cup. "You should start your upper floors before the household steward does his count." Emily started her upper floors. The staircase, the long corridor past the portrait hall, the guest wing that was not currently in use and therefore could be managed quickly. She moved through the palace the way she always moved through it. Efficiently, quietly, routing automatically around the spaces where she was likely to intersect with someone who outranked her, which was most spaces. She had a gift for animals. This was the one thing about herself she had noticed without being told. The palace kept hunting dogs in the south yard, large northern breeds that the king's kennel master managed with the same cold precision the king apparently applied to everything. They were not friendly dogs. They were working animals. They did not seek out human contact beyond what their training required. When Emily passed the south yard with her linen cart, they came to the fence. All of them, always. The kennel master had remarked on it once, to someone else, in a tone of mild scientific bafflement. Emily had heard him and kept walking. The horses were the same. The palace stable hands had learned to route Emily's linen deliveries through the back of the stable when the difficult horses were being managed. Because the difficult horses stopped being difficult when she was nearby. She did not touch them. She simply moved through the space and they settled. She had no explanation for this and had never offered one because no one with authority had ever asked her directly. She thought about this sometimes on the long corridors in the early morning. The way the dogs came to the fence. The way the horses' ears changed angle when she entered the building. The way something in the presence of distressed animals responded to something in her. Some quality she could not name because she had no vocabulary for it and no one had ever given her one. She thought about it again on the 43rd morning, finishing the upper east corridor, her cart wheels quiet on the stone, the crying above her continuous and familiar and yet somehow different in a way she could not locate or explain. She went back down to the laundry. She counted her linen. She started the lower west passage. She did not go to the nursery. Not yet. The night round was Emily's favorite shift, which said something about the kind of person she had become. There was a quality to the palace at 11 at night that it never had during the day. A particular quality of emptiness, the corridors belonging entirely to her, no one to route around, no one to look past her at the wall behind her head while she waited to be told where to direct herself. Just the torches and the stone and the distant reliable sound of Havenmoor continuing to exist outside the high windows. She moved through it efficiently, her cart wheels quiet on the flagstones, her pace the particular measured rhythm of someone who has calculated the exact speed at which work gets done without drawing attention to the person doing it. The crying was where it always was. She heard it from the far end of the east passage, the same frequency it had been for 43 nights, worn into the building like a groove worn into a step. She was accustomed to it. Her body had stopped registering it as emergency the way the body stops registering a persistent sound after enough exposure, It became background, texture, a fact about the corridor the way the drafts through the arrow-slit windows were a fact about the corridor. She was halfway down the passage when it changed. She stopped walking. It was not louder. It was not more distressed in any way she could have pointed to and named. It was a shift in quality. Something beneath the pitch. A frequency that landed in her sternum like a struck bell and vibrated there without explaining itself. She stood with her hands on the cart handles and tried to locate what had changed and could not locate it and understood, after a moment, that she was not going to be able to explain this to herself and that her feet were already deciding to move without consulting her. The nursery door was closed. She put her hand on it. There was no reason for her hand to be on the nursery door. The nursery was not her corridor. The nursery was 3 hierarchical categories above her access level, staffed by trained pack nurses and overseen by the king's household physician, and nothing about Emily's position in the palace gave her any legitimate reason to be standing where she was standing with her hand on the handle of a door she was not authorized to open. She opened it. The room was white and ornate and nothing like the rest of the palace. All carved wood and pale upholstery and high windows that must have been beautiful in daylight. A space built deliberately to be soft in a building that was otherwise not soft anywhere. A carved armchair sat in the far corner, high-backed, upholstered in ivory, the kind of chair designed to hold someone for long hours without announcing that this was what it was built for. 2 cradles in the center of the room, dark wood draped with pale silk. 2 small, furious bodies. 3 nurses. One sitting against the wall with her head back and her eyes closed, not asleep but somewhere past waking. One at the window, her arms crossed, her shoulders carrying the particular set of a person who has been tense for so long the tension has stopped being information and started being posture. The third looked up when Emily entered. Her eyes moved from Emily's face to the linen cart visible through the open door and back to Emily's face, and then she looked away again. She did not ask why Emily was there. She was too tired to ask why anyone was anywhere. Emily crossed the room. She did this without deciding to. She crossed the room in the way she had walked through the nursery door, which was to say her body made the decision before the part of her capable of explaining decisions was consulted. She reached the nearest cradle. She looked down at the twin inside, small face red and wet and entirely consumed by the communication of distress, small fists clenched, small body shaking with the effort of 43 days' worth of trying to be heard. She reached in. She picked him up. He stopped. Not gradually. Not with the slow subsidence of a child who has been soothed through conventional means. He stopped the way a candle stops when you put your hand around it. Immediate, complete, the absence of the thing so total that the room itself seemed to register it. His body went from rigid and thrashing to entirely slack in the space of 3 seconds, a boneless, exhausted surrender that pressed him heavily against her chest. He turned his face toward her neck, his fists uncurled. He stared up at her with dark, exhausted, wondering eyes. The specific expression of something that has been looking for a particular thing without knowing what it was looking for and has, without warning, found it. Emily stood very still and let herself be found. With her free hand she reached toward the second cradle and placed her palm flat on the second twin's chest. He quieted within moments, his crying tapering off not into silence but into the specific soft sounds of a child deciding, cautiously, to trust that the emergency might be over. The nurse at the window had turned around. The one against the wall had opened her eyes. The third one was staring at Emily with an expression that was somewhere between relief and the particular unease of someone who has just witnessed something they do not have a framework for. No one said anything. In the East Passage, Emily's cart sat unattended outside the open door. Somewhere above, in the study 3 floors up, a man who had not slept properly in 43 days lifted his head from a dispatch and sat very still for a moment, attending to an absence he could not yet name. Emily stood in the royal nursery of Havenmore holding both heirs to the kingdom, one against her chest and one quieting under her palm, and understood with the particular clarity of someone who has spent years making themselves invisible that she had just become, irrevocably and without any plan at all, extremely visible. She did not know what to do with that. She stayed anyway. The head nurse's name was Perith, and she had managed royal nurseries for 22 years, and she had never in those 22 years sent a report up the household chain at 11:30 at night. She sent one now. She wrote it carefully in the formal register required for communications that would pass through multiple sets of hands before reaching anyone with authority to act on them, and she described what had happened in precise, neutral language that nonetheless could not entirely contain the thing it was describing. Palace maid, Wolfless, no pack rank to speak of, had entered the nursery uninvited during the night round, had approached the cradles without permission. The twins had stopped crying. Both of them. Immediately. They were currently asleep. She read it back once, decided it was as accurate as language was going to allow, and handed it to the night footman. The night footman took it to the household steward's night deputy, who read it twice, decided it was above his authority to file without escalation, and took it to the household steward. The household steward read it 3 times, sat with it for 4 minutes, and took it to the king's secretary. The king's secretary received it at 3 in the morning with the expression of a man who had believed, until this moment, that he had encountered every variety of unusual communication his position required him to process. He took it to the king. The corridor outside the royal nursery was empty when Coin reached it except for the torches and the stone and the particular quality of silence that had been absent from this part of the palace for 43 days. He registered the silence before he registered anything else. His body knowing what his mind was still catching up to, 43 days of the opposite conditioning his every response to expect the sound and finding instead nothing, just the quiet movement of air through the high windows and the torchlight and the closed nursery door. He pushed it open. The nurses were arranged along the walls in various postures of exhausted relief. 2 of them finally, deeply asleep in their chairs. The nursery smelled of candle wax and warm wool and something else, something faint and clean and entirely out of place in a room that had smelled of distress for 6 weeks. In the carved ivory chair in the far corner, a young woman sat with her head tipped back and both twins against her chest, all 3 of them asleep with the complete, unself-conscious abandon of people who have given up on remaining upright and arrived somewhere better. Her hair was pale gold in the candlelight, fallen across her face and across the twins in equal measure. One of them had a fist wrapped in it. Neither of them appeared to notice or care. Coin stood in the doorway. He did not know how long he stood there. Long enough for one of the torches in the corridor behind him to gutter and settle. Long enough for the king's secretary, waiting at a respectful distance, to shift his weight from one foot to the other and then back again and then decide not to do it a 3rd time. He did not wake her. He turned, eventually, and walked back to his study, and spent the remaining hours before dawn reading dispatches that he processed and responded to with his usual precision and did not think about at all. By morning there was a palace guard posted outside the nursery door and a formal instruction, delivered through the household steward, that the maid currently occupying the nursery chair was to remain in the nursery until further notice. Her corridor duties were reassigned. Her linen cart was returned to the laundry. Her meals would be brought to her. Emily woke to find Rael and Caden still asleep against her, which told her, before she opened her eyes or registered anything else, that something had worked. Then she opened her eyes and found the guard through the open nursery door and revised her understanding of the situation. The king came at mid-morning. She stood when he entered, which dislodged Caden, who made a brief indignant sound and then settled against her side with the single-minded focus of an infant who has located warmth and intends to remain attached to it. Coin looked at this. He looked at Emily. He asked her 3 questions. How long had she worked in the palace? Whether she had any training in pack nursing or omega bonding practices. Whether she had touched the twins before last night. For years, she said. No. He nodded. He left. Emily stood in the ornate room with a royal infant attached to her side and the formal understanding that she was either being protected or detained and no information about which one and no one she could ask. She sat back down. Rael, still asleep, adjusted. Caden reached up and wrapped his fist in her hair the way his brother had done in the night, without opening his eyes, as though this was simply how things were organized and always had been. She let him. That night, late, she heard footsteps in the corridor. They stopped outside the door. The line of light beneath it changed, interrupted by the shadow of someone standing very still on the other side. She did not move. The twins slept. The shadow stayed for a long time. Then it moved away down the corridor, and the light under the door was unbroken again, and the palace was quiet in the way it had not been quiet for 43 days. And Emily sat in the ivory chair in the dark and held the king's sons and did not know what any of it meant. She knew it was not nothing. 3 weeks passed the way water passes through cupped hands, quickly, and leaving less than you expected. Emily's days organized themselves around the twins with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years structuring her existence around external requirements and found, for the first time, that she did not resent the structure. Rael and Caden ate at 6 and 10 and 2 and 6 again. A schedule the palace physician had established and that Emily observed with the same precision she had once applied to her linen counts. Between feedings there was playtime, which was a generous description of what actually occurred. 2 infants discovering independently and then simultaneously that their limbs could be directed with intention, and finding this so remarkable that they needed to demonstrate it on every surface within reach, including each other. She learned them as individuals the way you learn a place you live in, gradually, through accumulation, through the specific details that reveal themselves only over time. Rael was serious. He watched everything with dark, focused eyes that tracked movement across the room with an attention that seemed too deliberate for something his age, and he reached for Emily's hair with both hands every time she lifted him as though confirming, repeatedly, that it was still there and still the same. He did not smile easily. When he did, it was brief and considered, as though he had evaluated the situation and determined that a smile was the correct response, and Emily found that she worked for it in a way she found embarrassing and could not stop. Caden smiled at everything. He smiled at the window, at the ceiling, at the specific quality of afternoon light on the white walls, at Rael's expression of patient judgment, at Emily's face whenever it appeared in his field of vision regardless of her expression or what she was doing. He fell asleep in the middle of things, mid-feeding, mid-play, mid what appeared to be an important conversation he was having with his own hand, with a sudden totality that had alarmed Emily the first 4 times and now simply meant she kept a free arm available. He was unreservedly, indiscriminately delighted by being alive, and being in the same room as him was, Emily had discovered, quite difficult to do without some of it transferring. The palace adjusted around this arrangement with the slow, incremental recalibration of a large institution encountering something it had not scheduled for and could not immediately categorize. The nurses stopped looking at Emily sideways. Perith began including her in the morning briefings about the twins' overnight patterns as a matter of course, with the clipped practicality of a woman who had decided that hierarchy mattered less than information flow. The physician asked Emily 3 questions about her methods during his weekly visit, listened to her answers without expression, and made a note. Dorrit was permitted to visit on Thursdays. She brought tea and did not comment on the nursery's ornate appointments or on the fact of Emily's presence in them, which was its own form of kindness. Coin came to the doorway most evenings. He did not come at a consistent time, which meant it was not a scheduled visit, which meant he was passing by and stopping rather than planning to stop, which was a distinction Emily had noted and chosen not to examine. He never stayed long. He looked at the twins and occasionally at Emily, and then he went back to whatever the machinery of the kingdom required of him. She did not acknowledge these visits directly. It seemed to her that acknowledging them would require him to decide what they were, and she had no interest in being the person who forced that decision. On a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week, he came in. Not to the doorway, into the room. Emily was on the floor with both twins, Caden attempting to climb her arm with the focused determination of someone who had identified a goal and not yet understood the concept of obstacles. Rael sitting beside her with his characteristic expression of watchful assessment. Coin entered without announcement. Rael looked up and saw his father and raised both arms. The gesture was unambiguous. Coin crossed the room and picked him up with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who had not done this enough to do it without thinking and was doing it anyway. Rael pressed his face against his father's neck and went still with what appeared to be profound satisfaction. Emily lifted Caden and moved to the window. She did not look at Coin. She turned to face the glass and shifted Caden to her hip and pointed at something in the courtyard below. Nothing significant, a horse, a guard making his round, and gave the room behind her to the king and his son without being asked and without making anything of it. Coin stayed 20 minutes. He did not say anything when he left. He did not need to. Emily heard the door close and stayed at the window a moment longer, Caden's warm weight against her side, and was aware of a quiet accumulating around this arrangement. Not safety exactly, not yet, but the shape of something that might become safety if nothing disturbed it. The court had begun to talk. She heard it in the way she heard most things, adjacently through walls in the pauses between other conversations. What is the Wolfless maid doing in the royal nursery? Why does the king permit it? What does she have that the trained nurses didn't? The questions were not unfriendly. They were simply the sound of a palace that had encountered something inexplicable and was in the process of deciding what to do with it. Emily held Caden and watched the courtyard and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years learning to read temperature changes before they became weather, that the decision would not be made in her favor indefinitely. Lord Fenris Halling arrived on a Tuesday, which Emily would later identify as the day the temperature changed. She did not know who he was when he first appeared in the nursery doorway. She knew he was not a servant and not a physician and not one of the court officials who occasionally passed by with the incurious glance of people who had registered the nursery situation as resolved and had no further interest in its mechanics. He was tall, dark-haired like the king but lighter in his construction, less fortress, more facade, and he stood in the doorway with the relaxed authority of a man who considered all doorways to be his by default. He was warm to the twins immediately. Genuinely warm, she thought, which she noted because she had learned to note the difference. He crouched to their level when Caden crawled toward him. Let Rael examine his hand with the focused seriousness Rael brought to all examinations, made sounds that were unself-consciously fond. He loved them. She did not doubt that. He was politely invisible to her. Not rudely. Not with the flat dismissal of the court staff who had not yet recalibrated to her changed position. This was something more deliberate, a specific practice quality of not seeing that required more effort than seeing would have. He spoke to Perith about the twins' color, their weight, whether their feeding schedule had stabilized. He did not look at Emily once. Not when he entered, not during the visit, not when he left. She understood, with the instinctive pattern recognition of someone who had spent years reading rooms, that this was intentional. You do not work that hard at not seeing something unless the something concerns you. She said nothing. She moved to the window with Caden and stayed there until he was gone. The change in temperature was gradual at first. A conversation between two of the junior nurses that stopped slightly too quickly when Emily came through the adjoining door. A visit from the palace physician that included, for the first time, questions she could not entirely account for, whether she had any family history of Omega ability expression, whether she had received any formal training she had not previously disclosed. She answered accurately, as she always did, and watched him write something that took longer than her answers warranted. Dorrit came on Thursday as usual. She poured the tea and was quiet for longer than was usual for Dorrit, which was a signal in itself. There are people asking questions, she said finally. Emily waited. About how you do it, what you use, whether it's natural. Dorrit set down her cup. Questions like that don't stay questions long. In a palace like this one. I don't do anything, Emily said. I hold them. I stay. Dorrit looked at her with the expression she used when she considered a statement accurate but insufficient. I know that. You know that. The people asking questions are not interested in that answer. She paused. Be small, Emily. Be as small as you know how. Emily did not say that she had been as small as she knew how for 4 years, that smallness was the primary skill she had developed and maintained, that she had built her entire existence in this palace on the practice of taking up the minimum possible space. She did not say it because Dorrit knew all of it already, and saying it would only expose how little either of them could do with the information. She was small. She had always been small. It had not, historically, been sufficient protection. It simply delayed things. Lord Fenris came twice more that week. Both times warm to the twins, both times precisely not present toward Emily. Both times stopping to speak with Perith on his way out in tones too low to carry across the nursery. She watched Perith's face during these conversations and learned nothing from it except that Perith was better at neutrality than Emily had previously credited. She did not know what was being built. She knew the shape of the activity, the careful, documented, patient assembly of something, because she had watched enough palace politics from the edges to recognize the behavior if not the substance. Someone was constructing an argument. Arguments constructed this carefully, with this much preliminary groundwork, did not get constructed unless the person building them intended to use them. She held rail at the window and watched the courtyard and felt the temperature continuing its quiet drop, and had no mechanism to address it and no language to name it and no one with sufficient authority to take the information to even if she had. Fenris presented his case to the king 3 weeks after his first nursery visit. Emily did not know this had happened until she read it in the changed quality of Coin's expression the following morning in the doorway. Something closed where there had previously been something merely unreadable. He stood there for less time than usual. Then he left. The twins slept against her chest, entirely unaware that the argument about whether their attachment to her was real or manufactured was already well underway. The evidence already assembled, the conclusion already decided by people who had never once considered asking them. The summons arrived on a Friday morning, delivered by a palace messenger who handed it to Perith rather than to Emily directly, which was itself a statement about the nature of what was happening. Perith brought it to her without ceremony. Emily read it, set it on the side table, finished settling rail for his morning rest, and then stood for a moment with her hands at her sides and looked at the window. The courtyard below was going about its ordinary business. A groom crossing with 2 horses, a delivery cart at the east gate, the unremarkable continuity of a palace that would not pause for what was about to happen to her. She had known something was coming. She had known it since Fenris's 3rd visit, since the physician's questions, since Dorrit's warning and the particular quality of Perith's neutrality in those corridor conversations. Knowing had not made it smaller. It had simply made the waiting its own kind of wait. She straightened her uniform. She went. The hearing chamber was on the 2nd floor of the administrative wing, a room she had passed the door of many times in 4 years without ever having a reason to enter. It was larger than she had imagined, high-ceilinged, stone-walled, a long table where the King's Council sat in their formal positions and a space at the center of the room where she was directed to stand by a clerk who did not meet her eyes. The room smelled of candle wax and old paper and the specific institutional gravity of a space in which decisions had been made for a very long time. She stood in the center of it in her maid's uniform and understood, in a way she had not quite understood in the abstract, that she had never before been worth the formality of this room. There was a specific flavor to being judged by people who were also slightly surprised to find themselves judging you. She recognized it. She stood straight. Fenris presented his case from the far end of the table. He was measured and thorough and entirely without visible hostility, which was, she had learned, his most effective quality. He did not accuse her of malice. He was careful to note, twice, that she may not have been aware of what she was doing. Suppressed omega bonding magic of this particular variety, artificially attaching an infant to the practitioner's sense signature through repeated close contact and low-frequency resonance manipulation, was documented in pack records going back 2 centuries. It was not always deliberate. Wolfless omegas with latent ability expression sometimes activated the practice instinctively, without intention, without understanding what they were producing. This was, she noted, a very elegant construction. It made her simultaneously a threat and a victim of her own nature, and left the council with a clean resolution available. Remove her without cruelty, treat the attachment as a medical complication rather than a personal failing, wish her well at a significant distance. They asked her questions. She answered them. She described what had happened on the 43rd night in the same plain language she had used with the king, the change in the crying, the instinct to respond, the twins going quiet. She had no training. She used no methods. She held them and stayed and they slept. She did not have a more technical account to offer because there was no more technical account. She said this clearly and without apology and watched the council receive it with the polite attention of people who had already decided that this explanation, while possibly sincere, was insufficient. She could not give them the language they were looking for. She did not have it. The gift, if it was a gift, had no vocabulary she had been taught, and she could not explain a thing she had never been given words for. Coin sat at the head of the table throughout. She looked at him once during her testimony, briefly, and found his face entirely unreadable in the way it sometimes was. Not cold exactly, but closed. A man who had made a decision and sealed the room it was in. The council deliberated for 11 minutes. She stood at the center of the chamber and looked at a point on the far wall and waited. The clerk brought the settlement. Formal removal from the royal wing. Prohibition on approaching the princes or any member of the royal household without explicit written authorization. A severance amount that was generous enough to communicate that no one in this room considered themselves to be treating her badly. She signed it. She did not read it through first. There was nothing in it she had the standing to contest. She walked out of the chamber without looking back, down the corridor, past the East Passage junction, toward the servants' stairs. Behind her, from the direction of the royal wing, she heard it begin. Faint at first, then unmistakable, rising through the stone floors the way it had risen for 43 days before she had opened a door she was not authorized to open. The twins were screaming. She kept walking. She had signed the paper. The palace had processed her and reached its conclusion, and the system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. She walked down the servants' stair and through the lower passage and out into the gray morning, and there was nothing in any of it that she could point to as obviously wrong. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the verdict. The cleanliness of it. The outer servants' quarters were exactly as she had left them. This was the thing that struck her first, and kept striking her over the 3 days that followed. The complete, indifferent continuity of the world she had come from. Her room was her room. Her hook on the wall held the spare apron she had not taken to the nursery. The window looked out on the same section of inner courtyard it had always looked out on. The corridor outside her door smelled of stone and tallow and the distant kitchen. And in the morning the bell rang at 4 and she woke before it as she always had and lay in the gray dark for a moment and then rose and dressed and went to her corridor round because there was nothing else to do and because the body, trained for 4 years to this specific sequence of actions, did not particularly consult her about it. The East Passage, the Tapestry Hall, the loose 7th stair, all of it waiting unchanged. For her to slide back into it like a hand into a glove it had never stopped fitting. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The practice of smallness, the return to invisibility, these were her most developed skills and they came back to her without effort. Her body remembering the exact degree of presence required to move through a palace without registering. She answered to girl and you there. She routed around authority. She completed her counts and her rounds and her linen tallies with the quiet efficiency that had made her, for 4 years, the kind of servant that senior staff described as reliable without being able to immediately name. Through the walls, from the direction of the royal wing, she could hear it. It was not constant. It ebbed and surged the way it had in the early days of the 43, before she had learned to hear it as background. She had lost that conditioning now. Whatever the nursery had done to her capacity for distance had not reversed itself simply because she had signed a piece of paper and walked out of the building. She heard every surge. She heard the quality of exhaustion underneath it. She heard the specific note that had stopped her in the East Passage 6 weeks ago, and she heard it now, through 2 floors and 3 corridors of stone, and could do nothing with it. She did her work. She was very good at doing her work. Dorrit came on the 2nd evening. She appeared at Emily's door without announcement, which was her way, and sat in the room's single chair and poured from the pot she had brought with her into the room's single cup and handed it across. She did not comment on the room. which was small and dim and a significant distance in every sense from where Emily had been sleeping for the past 6 weeks. She did not comment on the crying, which was audible even here, faintly, like something heard through deep water. She sat with Emily and drank her own tea from the pot lid and was quiet in the specific way of someone who has decided that the most useful thing they can offer is the absence of requirement. Before she left, she set a small wrapped parcel on the table. The wrapping was a piece of clean linen tied with kitchen string. "Came through the laundry by mistake," Dorrit said. "Thought you'd want to return it properly." She left without elaboration. Emily unwrapped it after she heard Dorrit's footsteps disappear down the corridor. Inside was a small wool sock, cream-colored, the size of her palm, the particular weave she recognized from the nursery linen order. Rails, she thought, from the width of it. He had broader feet than his brother. A detail she knew the way she knew which floorboard near the cradles creaked, and which side Caden preferred to sleep on, and the exact weight of a sleeping twin against her left shoulder versus her right. She held it for a long time. She was not certain what she was feeling. It was not grief exactly, though it had grief's texture. It was the specific weight of having been briefly and entirely accidentally necessary to something and then not. The sock was warm-colored against her palm and very small, and she held it until the candle burned low and then set it on the windowsill where she could see it from the bed. On the third morning the bell rang and she rose before it and dressed and went to her corridor and completed the east passage and the tapestry hall and was on the back stair when a palace messenger appeared at the bottom of it, slightly out of breath, holding a folded paper with a seal she recognized pressed in dark wax. The king's personal seal, not the household seal, not the administrative staff seal. She came down the stairs and took it. The messenger waited. She broke the seal. She read 4 lines. She looked up at the wall in front of her for a moment, at the stone, at the tallow mark from a torch bracket that had been there for years and that no one had yet cleaned off. Then she folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket and told the messenger she understood. She walked the same route she had always walked. This was not sentiment. It was simply the most direct path from the outer servants' quarters to the east wing, and Emily had never been the kind of person who took an indirect route when a direct one was available. The east passage, the tapestry hall, the loose 7th stair. Her feet knew it. Her body moved through it with the same quiet efficiency it had moved through it for 4 years, and she did not look at the corridor differently or feel the stone differently or find any of it changed. What was different was smaller than that. It was the quality of her own presence in the space. The awareness, which she had not carried before the nursery, that she had been somewhere and was returning to it. You cannot go back to invisibility the same way once something has seen you. She had learned that in the past 3 days. The coat still fit. It was simply no longer the only coat she owned. Coin was waiting in the nursery anteroom. He was not pacing. He was standing with his arms at his sides in the manner of a man who had decided where to be and was being there, looking at the middle distance with an expression she could not read and had stopped trying to read, and he did not offer any preliminary when she came through the door. He did not explain the summons or the 3 days or the settlement she had signed or the decision that had produced it. He turned to the nursery door. He opened it. He stepped back. She went in. She heard them before she reached the cradles. Not the screaming, the change in the screaming, the shift in frequency she had first heard in the East Passage 6 weeks ago. The note beneath the note that her body responded to before her mind caught up. They had tracked her by scent from across the room. By the time she reached the nearest cradle, Rail was already pulling himself upright against the rail with both fists, his face still wet, his whole body communicating the specific combination of relief and reproach that she had not known infants were capable of until she had spent 6 weeks learning these 2 particular infants. She gathered them both. They pressed against her with a desperation that was different from their usual weight, heavier, more urgent, the clinging of children who have been frightened for longer than they had language for and are not yet certain the frightening is finished. Rail pressed his face into her neck and went still. Caden made a series of small broken sounds that were worse than the crying had been and then stopped, his fist finding her hair. his breathing evening out in the slow, deliberate way of something winding down from a long run. She stood in the nursery with both of them and felt the room settle around her the way it always settled and did not look at the doorway. She looked eventually. Coin was there, in the same position he occupied most evenings, arms at his sides, watching. He had not moved. He watched her and the twins with the expression she had come to associate with the doorway. Not the closed expression from the hearing, not the contained fury of the man who had come through the corridor on the 43rd night, but something more open than either of those, something that had not entirely decided what it was. He let the silence run until both twins were quiet and she had moved to the window out of habit, Caden drowsing against her shoulder and Rael making his considered examination of her face. Then he said that he was calling a second council session, that he required her to be present, that she would not be dismissed again. She looked at him. She asked what he intended to do. He said, "Correct a mistake." Then he left. She heard him in the corridor that night, working. The study was 3 floors above the nursery and sound did not carry that far through stone, but she knew he was there the way she had learned to know the shape of his presence in the building, an awareness she had developed without meaning to, the way you develop an awareness of any persistent feature of a place you inhabit. The lamp in his study window threw a line of light into the courtyard below that did not go out until past 3 in the morning. He was in the records. She understood this without being told. He was in the same records Fenris had used, and he was finding what Fenris had omitted, and he was doing it with the same precision he applied to dispatches and border decisions and every other problem his kingdom set in front of him. Methodically, without sentiment, because the truth was more useful to him than the convenient alternative, and he had finally, at considerable cost, decided to act on it. He was not apologizing. She did not need him to apologize. She needed him to do the right thing, and the light in his study window was still burning when she finally closed her eyes, the twins warm and slack against her in the ivory chair, and that was enough. That was, for tonight, entirely sufficient. They gave her a chair at the front of the chamber. This was Coin's instruction, delivered through the household steward the morning of the hearing, and it was specific enough that no one had questioned it. A chair positioned at the front of the room, facing the council table. Not to the side, not in the back. At the front, where the council could see her and she could see them, and there was no ambiguity about the fact that she had been placed there deliberately by the king. She settled into it with both twins already drowsing, worn out from their morning feed, and adjusted Rael's weight against her left side and Caden's against her right, and found the position she had learned over 6 weeks to hold for long periods without shifting, the position that kept them sleeping. Then she looked at the twins and did not look at the room. The chamber filled around her. She heard it, the particular acoustic of a high-ceilinged stone room receiving a large number of people trying to move quietly and not entirely succeeding, and she did not turn to watch it happen. She was aware of Fenris at the far end of the council table, composed, his hands arranged in front of him with the careful neutrality of a man who has prepared thoroughly and is waiting for the performance to begin. She was aware of the court healer in his formal robes near the sidewall. She was aware of the quality of attention in the room, the specific alert stillness of a large number of people who have come to watch something they believe will be significant. Coin opened the session without preamble. He presented his case the way she had watched him conduct everything, without decoration, without apparent awareness that the room's temperature was running high, simply moving through the material in the order he had determined was most effective and not adjusting his pace for anyone's reaction. He had brought the records himself. The original volumes, not copies, which meant he had gone into the archive personally rather than sending a clerk. He laid them on the table and read the relevant passages and then read the passages that surrounded them. The context Fenris's presentation had not included, the scholarship that preceded and followed the section selected, the 3 generations of deliberate omission that became visible only when you looked at what was absent rather than what had been cited. The nurturing resonance. Not a myth, not a manipulation technique. The oldest documented Omega ability in the pack records, predating the current hierarchy's classification system by 2 centuries, described in the earliest texts in terms that were unambiguous about its nature. A deep pack gift, involuntary, manifesting as sent comfort in infants who had lost their primary bonded caretaker. Sacred, in the oldest understanding of that word. Not transgressive. Protected. Systematically removed from the active scholarship over 3 generations by Pack academics who had found, apparently, that its existence complicated the narrative about Wolfless Omega's being without meaningful ability. The omission was documented in the academic correspondence he had also found in the archive, letters between scholars, decisions made in committee, the quiet, bureaucratic suffocation of an inconvenient truth. He read those too. Fenris's counterargument came in 3 parts and lost a structural element with each of Coin's responses, the third part collapsing before he had finished making it because the foundation it had been standing on was no longer there. He did not visibly crumble. He was too well trained for that. But the chamber heard the hollowness in it, and Emily, who was not looking at him, felt the room's response shift in the way a tide shifts. Not dramatic, simply directional, pulling away from the shore it had been running toward. The court healer's confirmation was brief and formal and delivered in the precise register of a man submitting evidence rather than offering opinion. Emily carried the nurturing resonance. The ability was genuine, documented, and involuntary. The bond with the princes was real. There was no evidence of manipulation because manipulation was structurally incompatible with how the gift functioned. He sat down. Coin announced her rank without ceremony, at the end, as a statement of administrative fact. The rank itself, the specific designation, the first of its kind in Havenmore in living memory. He said it the way he said everything. Flatly, finally, in a tone that indicated the matter was resolved and he had moved on to considering what came next. Emily did not move. The twins slept. She held them and breathed and kept her eyes on Rail's face, on the small, reliable motion of his chest, on the fist curled loosely against her collarbone. When the session closed, she looked up. Coin was watching her from the head of the table. The distance between them was the full length of the chamber, and across it his expression was the one she had seen in the nursery doorway. Not closed, not unreadable, not the careful blankness of a man managing his own reactions. Something that had not decided what it was yet. Something that had been accumulating, she thought, for longer than either of them had been paying attention to it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then Caden shifted against her and she looked down, and when she looked up again Coin was speaking to the court healer, the business of the kingdom already reassembling itself around him. But he had looked. She had seen him look. And for a woman who had spent 4 years in a palace that had never once looked back at her, that was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. The palace was quiet in the way it had not been quiet for a long time. Not the silence of 43 days ago, that had been the silence around a sound, the held breath of a building braced against something relentless. This was different. This was the quiet of an evening that had nothing pressing in it. The corridors belonging to the torches and the stone and the ordinary movement of a household settling into its nighttime rhythms. A guard making his round on the east passage. The distant sound of the kitchen finishing its work. The high windows letting in the last of the gray evening light before the dark came fully down. Coin had dispatches. He had had dispatches for 3 days, a particular accumulation of Northern Territory reports that required his specific attention and that he had been addressing in the order they had arrived, methodically, without the distraction of the hearing or the 3 days before it or the 3 weeks before those. The hearing was finished. The records were back in the archive. Fenris had left the chamber without speaking to him, which was fine. Fenris would regroup and find another angle because that was what Fenris did, and Coin would address that when it took shape, and in the meantime there were the Northern Territory reports and the trade agreement amendment that needed his signature before morning and 2 letters from Allied Pack leaders that required responses calibrated to a degree of diplomatic precision that he had not yet had the sustained attention to apply. He was going to his study. He came down the east corridor instead. He did not examine this. He was not, in general, a man who spent significant effort examining the minor navigational decisions of his own evenings, and he was not going to start now. He came down the east corridor the way he had come down it most evenings for 6 weeks, and he stopped outside the nursery door the way he had stopped outside it most evenings for 6 weeks, and he put his hand on the door and pushed it quietly open. The room was dim, one lamp burning low on the far table, the rest of the light coming from the last of the evening through the high windows. The nurses had gone for their dinner break, or perhaps the night shift had not yet begun. There was a gap, sometimes, between the two, a span of 20 minutes or so that the nursery managed on its own. He had noticed this gap before and had made a note to speak to Perith about it and had not yet spoken to her. In the ivory chair, Emily was asleep. Both twins were against her chest, Rael on the left and Caden on the right, arranged in the configuration he had seen enough times now that he could have described it from memory. Rael with his fist curled in her hair, as always, his face turned in toward her neck, his expression in sleep the same considered seriousness it held when he was awake. Caden with his mouth slightly open, one hand spread flat against her collarbone. His whole body the boneless declaration of someone who has found exactly where he intends to be and has no further concerns. Emily's golden hair had fallen across her face and across both of them in equal measure, and the three of them breathed together in the particular slow rhythm of shared sleep, and the room was entirely, completely still. Coin stood in the doorway in his dark armor and did not move. The dispatches were in his study. The trade agreement needed his signature. The Allied pack leaders required responses calibrated to diplomatic precision. The kingdom was a machine that required his constant attention to function correctly, and he was standing in a nursery doorway in the dark looking at a sleeping woman and his sleeping sons and not going back to his study. He stood there for a long time. The kingdom was not changed. He understood this clearly. The court was not changed and Fenris would regroup, and the hierarchy that had made Emily invisible for 4 years would not dismantle itself because one king had corrected one council decision, however precisely. The work of it was longer than this evening and more complicated and would require the kind of sustained, systematic attention that he was capable of applying and had not yet fully committed to applying. He knew this. He also knew that in this room, right now, there was only the sound of 3 people breathing, and that it was the quietest he had felt since before the 43 days began, and that this was information he was going to have to eventually do something with. He pulled the door closed without sound. He went back down the east corridor to his study. He signed the trade agreement. He began the first of the Allied pack letters and wrote 3 sentences and stopped and sat for a moment looking at the wall. He would come back to the doorway tomorrow. He understood this about himself already, with the same clarity he applied to border reports and resource assessments. He would come back, and the night after, and he did not yet have a name for the reason and was not going to invent one prematurely. He was a precise man. He did not name things before he understood them. He understood this much. It was not nothing. The woman in the ivory chair, who had entered an unauthorized room on instinct and signed a settlement without argument and walked back through the same corridor when he summoned her without asking him for more than he had offered. She was not nothing to him. She had not been nothing for some time. He was simply, at last, admitting the accounting. He went back to the Allied pack letter. He finished it before midnight. He did not go back to the nursery that night, but he thought about the breathing, and the hair fallen across all 3 of them like something that had always been arranged that way, and the quality of quiet that the room held, and he filed all of it with the precision he applied to everything that mattered. They would remember her first. Rael and Caden, who were too young for the kind of memory that survives into speech and story but not too young for the kind that goes deeper than that, the memory of warmth and specific scent and a voice that came when the frightening was loudest. They would grow up in a kingdom that had almost discarded her, shaped by the fact that it had not, and when they were old enough to understand what that meant they would do what young kings do with the knowledge of their father's mistakes. They would be better. Slowly, systematically, with the same precision their father had eventually turned toward the truth, they would be better. Every law he did not get around to dismantling, they would dismantle. Every wall the hierarchy had built around people like her, they would dismantle. Because they had slept against her chest in the worst weeks of their lives, and their bones knew before their minds could that worth was not measured the way the palace had always measured it. That was the thing the nursery had done that no council session could undo. The lamp in Coin's study window burned until nearly 3. In the nursery below, the ivory chair held its quiet cargo undisturbed, and the palace of Havenmoor breathed around them, and the 43 days were over, and something that did not yet have a name had begun. Write in the comments section your thoughts about the story. Subscribe to this channel, like and share. Thank you for staying till the end.